Okay. Good morning, everyone. Today we will be going over the second part of the Great Depression lecture, or for lack of a better term. I'll just call this the New Deal. The Great Depression one was really about the causes in the late 20s for the stock market crash and how that stock market crash then infected the banking system and how the US fared in those 4 years or so after the stock market crash and then up to the very large number of bank failures that happened in early 1933. So, today we're going to get in much more detail about FDR in terms of being president, his governing style, etc. The transfer of power on March the 4th, 1933 is one of the most important turning points in our entire history. Um, Probably number one would be Lincoln's election in 1860, and then, secession, and then his inauguration in 1861 led to the Civil War. This is another time where it would be very hard to overstate how drastic things were at that particular point. Last time I went over the bank failures and how they were increasing and they kind of leveled off, and then they will spike to unbelievable heights in early 1933. If I could go back here, I think I have some stats on that just to hammer the point home to you guys. Just in the first 2 months, in the first 60 days of 1933, there were 4,000 bank failures, representing about 18% of all the banks in the entire country failed in just 60 days. It looked like we were in complete free fall. And there was a very real prospect that very nearly every bank in America might fail by the summer, certainly by the fall of 1933, if the government didn't do something to actually intervene to come in and stop this. It was really terrifying, and the downward spiral was accelerating. Each bank failure, remember, will cause maybe 5 to 10 others because people are afraid and they take their own money out. And banks are spending money on insurance, trying to calm their customers, saying, no, no, this bank is insured. Even if it fails, we'll give you your money back. And people started asking, well, what if they all fail and then the insurance company goes bankrupt? Then I'm really out of luck. This is one of those instances where government really needs to come in and calm everybody because it was just sheer panic, sheer pandemonium. Many people thought that Hoover was turning over a country that was about to fall off of a cliff in 1933. Maybe there would be nothing left. And it seemed rather weird to people because Americans had the same skills in 1933 that they had in 1929. All the factories still had their productive output. We had the same technology. So why couldn't we just all go back to work? Well, it didn't quite work that way. Different economists had different theories as to what was the nature of the problem and what was the solution to that problem. But honestly, Roosevelt didn't even know very well himself. Roosevelt was probably the least ideological president we ever had, meaning I don't want to paint him as, nihilistic, that he didn't believe in anything, but he held no dogmatic beliefs. A dogma is a belief or set of beliefs that you believe so much that it's impervious to any kind of logical argument, right? That you believe. Sometimes it's used in terms of religion, other times it's used in terms of political ideology, but I've seen all types. And you can't argue with these people because if you show them evidence to the contrary, they just hold up their belief and say, no, I disbelieve the evidence that you just showed me, right? Um, this this new president was not one of those types. He was incredibly pragmatic. He understood what most of us do when we get older is that the real world doesn't really operate the way that ideological people think it does, right? Some people are hardcore libertarians. Government's always bad. No, you could point to several instances where it actually can help an economy. Or you might be of the opinion that, well, the free market is terrible. You need to control everything. No, there's several instances where that's bad too. You just have to be pragmatic. What works and what has the best result, and do that, and don't get all emotional about what theory it comes from. That was Franklin Roosevelt. He kind of likened himself to a quarterback. He said, let's try this plan, and if it works, great. If we gain some yards out of it, wonderful. If it doesn't, throw it out and try a different play, but let's just try a bunch of different stuff. Doesn't sound like a very ideological plan, like here's the way out of it. It was just like scattershot, let's try everything. That was the New Deal. It was on March the 4th, 1933, FDR himself had really no idea what he was actually going to do when he became president. But he gave a wonderful, soothing address where he tried to calm down everyone's fears. And he gave this wonderful inaugural address where he said, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Meaning that the fundamentals underneath the panic and everything were still solid. It was just panic and fear that were driving this economic collapse. If everybody would just calm down and stop taking their money out of the bank, they would be fine. Now, it would take a lot more than that, but he was trying to set the tone at the beginning. Roosevelt goes right to work. He meets with several Democrats and Republicans from various banking committees, and they basically tell him, this is what we were working on under Herbert Hoover, but he refused to take any action on it. Probably cynically thinking the worse the economy was, the less likely Americans would be to turn it over to someone who hadn't been president before. But Americans thought the opposite. They thought the worse it was, the more we're going to blame Herbert Hoover for messing it up to begin with. And so now comes the New Deal. The first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration, basically March through June of 1933, 15 different major laws were passed, creating an alphabet soup of different agencies. On balance, it's very hard to say. Historians have struggled with this question ever since. Was the New Deal effective? Did it work? Well, it's complicated. It's such a big, huge array of programs. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. By far, and I'll go over all of it, so don't worry. I mean, basically the long and short of it is the New Deal certainly helped in reforming the economy and getting some regulations, but it did not fix the problem itself, the basic problem of recovery. That took another 12 years of limping along before we finally got out of it. Was that Roosevelt's fault? Was it not? Well, you guys can decide that after I give you all the information. By far, without a doubt, the most important thing that Roosevelt did for the Great Depression, because his presidency is divided into two different 6-year terms. The first 6 years, 33 to 39, is really dealing with the Great Depression. 39 to 45 is really dealing with World War II. And it's a totally different story to get into, and we will on our next lecture. But that first 6 years, the most important thing that Roosevelt did was in the first week. That was unambiguously effective, needed, warranted, and saved the day. This is known as the Emergency Banking Act. So what Roosevelt did his very first couple of days in office is he essentially passed this law that would fix the banking failures. And here's kind of how it worked. Now, first, it declared what he called a banking holiday. The law claimed that it gave him the authority to shut all the banks in the country. Now, this is a really weird thing where the constitutionality of this was never tested. A lot of people said, can the president even do this, shut down every bank in the country? Well, he can if they don't complain about it. And they didn't complain about it. Why didn't they complain about it, do you think? Give you guys a minute. I'm asking rhetorical questions to myself now. It was because they realized that the panic would stop under this and they would stop going bankrupt. They would stop failing, essentially. That if the government said you can't go into a bank because it's closed, then the bank can't fail, basically. Sorry, it took me a little while to articulate that, but that's basically the reason why. So what a weird collusion or conspiracy between the government and the banks. They sort of agreed, let's just close the doors so that all these panicked, paranoid people can't go in and take their money out. And so that's essentially what he did. He declared like a 1-week holiday, which was asking a lot. This is a day and age where there's hardly anyone has credit cards. Only the richest people do. There's no banking cards. You got cash by going to the bank every week, pretty much, sometimes more than that. I'm old enough where I remember in the 80s, ATMs existed, but mostly just in the lobby of banks themselves. You'd have to still go to a bank that was open. Saturdays, they closed at 2. Sundays, they were closed entirely. And I still remember on a Friday or Saturday, every Friday, Saturday, going with my father to the bank to get cash. Because if you ran out of money over the weekend, we can't do anything, right? Checkbooks existed, but those were annoying and a lot of places wouldn't take them. Credit cards, my parents weren't really big on those. In the 30s, none of that stuff really existed. So this was a huge imposition, but it was felt that it was necessary. In those 4 or 5 days while the banks were closed, banking regulators would descend on the banks. They would go into every bank, meet with the bank manager, check the books, check the records, and then do one of two things. Either allow them to open back up, and if they did, now the government would say, here's a new list of regulations, here's your reserve requirements, you have to buy insurance. Everyone will have to buy what's called FDIC, Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation. So banks would be forced to buy insurance, and that would be broadcast to everyone. The letters FDIC would be on the front windows of every bank in the country, and that would give confidence to people to leave their money in and not take it out. Why go and take my money out where even if it does fail, the government will cut me a check within a week? And they still do. Any bank you go into in the country, you'll see the letters FDIC. So that calms people down. So they don't say, let me take my money out and, put it in a safe at home. It's safer in the bank because it's insured. Whether it's robbed or whether it goes bankrupt, you'll get your money within just a few days. So don't worry about it. Then he had to communicate what this law was all about because there was a lot of misinformation. As you might imagine, this is the country of fake news. A lot of people just sort of make stuff up. And so Roosevelt went on this new invention, the radio, which had been out in the 20s, but presidents hadn't really used it before. And he gave the first of 15 fireside chats. Now, that breaks down to about one every 10 months during his presidency. He didn't go on the radio all that often because he thought it would diminish the power of it. But he felt he had to do something. So he went on the radio and he gave a 15-minute address about banking, basically. Here's how banks work, here's why they failed, and here's the solution. And Americans listened. This was a day and age where people were amazed that the president could talk to you in their own home. Radios back then were giant pieces of furniture that you would like put pictures on and stuff, and everybody would huddle around it. And little boys were told, get your Sunday best on, get your suit and tie on. Little girls, put your nice dresses on because the president's coming over and wants to talk to us. And the whole family would huddle around and listen for however long the president spoke. One of the most amazing stories I ever heard about FDR was that in the middle of World War II in 1942, Americans went to baseball games that summer, and Roosevelt gave a 45-minute radio address explaining the status of the war, like where soldiers were in Papua New Guinea and where they were in Italy, and he went over all of it. And they broadcast it live at the stadiums. They stopped play for 45 minutes so Americans could just, and people were just sitting there kind of leaning forward in their seats, just sort of listening to the president. Really amazing. It's sort of the opposite now, I would say. For a while there, I would say, President Trump was someone who could command attention and we were all hanging on his every tweet. But Biden's kind of brought boring back, as a lot of people say. That's why a lot of people like him, because they're like, oh, I don't, have to watch the news all the time. In the 30s, this was new and exciting. And so everyone sat and listened. Let me play you just a little bit. I'll play you like a minute or a minute and a half of the fireside chat, because it's rather interesting. I want you guys to hear FDR's voice, and I want you to hear kind of what he said, because we live in a very different world today where I do not think that if Biden gave, a 15-minute address on anything, most people would listen to it or watch it. Okay, so here we go.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of...
Okay. And it goes on like that. Now, you guys today might say, it's just boring. Who could listen to that? Well, if you're in the middle of a huge crisis where you're terrified that you're going to lose your job and your life savings, you might listen to the new president because he might have some answers. And he did have answers. First, it is a rather dry speech. But second, what a marvelous voice. I love FDR's voice. It's just soothing, grandfatherly. He had this old patrician, like I said, tutored voice that Americans just don't do anymore. This is something that the English did a long time ago to distinguish the classes, is that if you are in the royal family, the nobility, the elite, you go to special schools like Eton and Cambridge and Oxford, and you send your kids off to prep school, literally like 5-year-olds. Bye-bye, Johnny. See you at Christmas time. And you send your little 5-year-old off to almost like a military style school where they're taught, intense discipline, etc. That's what Roosevelt went to, but in America, these prep schools have largely died out. Most people don't send their kids to them anymore. And when people do go to them, they don't do elocution or diction lessons anymore. They used to teach little young boys and girls the proper way to speak correctly in the English language. And Roosevelt definitely had that. He had it in spades. And so people listen to it. He must know what he's talking about. He just sounds so intelligent and grandfatherly, right? And you saw the date there, hopefully, March the 12th. This was just 8 days after he assumed the presidency. He gave this address and people listened. They followed what the president said. They stopped taking money out of the banks and the banking crisis stopped. If you look at those bank failure charts for the rest of Roosevelt's presidency, almost none. There's just like 1 year, 1937, in the beginning of that year, there was sort of a wave of bank failures, but not that many, like 500 or 600 compared to 4,000, which was just in the first 60 days of 1933. This was amazingly the most effective thing he did in his entire 6 years as president, was just this speech and the Emergency Banking Act. But at the end of the day, all it really did was set a floor. It didn't get ourselves out of the Great Depression. All that it did was Americans now knew where the bottom was, and they said, okay, well, now we have to sort of, climb our way out. Which is going to be called the New Deal. Roosevelt had a slew of advisors called the Brain Trust, and some of them were very pro-capitalist bankers. Some of them were left-wingers, socialists and whatnot. And it's very unfair. He's been tarred as all kinds of different things. People will say Roosevelt was a communist or a socialist or a fascist. He was none of those things. He was an American Democrat. And he just took from a wide variety of programs and tried different things. Some of it worked brilliantly. Some of it didn't work at all. But the idea was to try stuff. And if there was one overall sort of arcing theme, it was Keynesianism. So let's talk just for a minute about John Maynard Keynes, one of the greatest economists in the history of the world. It's this guy. If you were wondering, who's this guy at the beginning, or these two gentlemen at the beginning of the lecture? The guy on the right is economist John Maynard Keynes. The guy on the left is Harry Dexter White, sort of his counterpart in America. Harry Dexter White was the Secretary of the Treasury under Roosevelt, very brilliant banker. He would disgrace himself after World War II by working with the Soviets and being an actual spy for the Soviet Union and leaking secrets to them. But nobody knew that in the 30s. And at that time, he seemed like a pretty smart and capable guy. And Keynes was a British economist who was basically writing the book about the Great Depression. Understand that when the Great Depression happened, nobody knew exactly what they were watching unfold. Nobody had ever seen an economic collapse like this before. One of the reasons why the Great Depression is so bad is that it's really the first time in American history and in Western civilization where most people live in cities rather than the countryside. If you live in a city, you basically need a job unless you are a business owner yourself. But that's well over 90% of us work rather than own our own business. And so what do when you just blow a hole in the economy and there's no jobs? In 1819, when you had a panic, only 8% of people lived in big cities. And so you could absorb that shock. There was enough territory in the West for people to go farm and rely on themselves. And sure, prices might collapse, but you never starve. You faced a real proposition that people might starve in America during this time, especially when thousands of farmers every single day were walking off their farms because they couldn't make ends meet anymore. Might the food supply collapse in certain areas of the country and there'll be hungry children? What would FDR do then? And so Keynes wrote the book about what exactly was wrong, this sort of dilemma I was telling you about before, where most Americans said, I don't get it. We have the same technology, workers, businesses, everything, but nobody's working and the economy's at a standstill. Keynes had a lot of math to explain this, but essentially what he said was, it's sort of like a car where the battery has died. All the parts are fine and it's a working automobile. Some people were saying you need to throw the whole thing away and start over, or you need to, move parts of the car around, like move people out of the countryside to the city or vice versa. And he said, no. All you really need to do is give a good shock to the car and it'll start again and it'll get going. And what he said that was the government need to exercise deficit spending. This is now accepted practice in pretty much every government in the world. We're talking right now in 2021 about an economic stimulus bill. Because of the pandemic right now, people aren't working as much, people aren't going out and spending as much. And so we're talking about a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. What does stimulus mean? What it means is, since citizens themselves aren't going out and spending, government can come in and spend and create demand where none exists. How does government spend money? It borrows by selling treasury bonds, because there's a lot of wealthy people that just sit on their cash or they invest it in different things. They will buy the treasury bonds, the government will have money, and they'll go out and spend. And so today it's like, well, what do we need? Well, we need plexiglass shields and we need N95 face masks and we need COVID testing and vaccines. But also, while we're at it, why don't we fix some of our crumbling infrastructure, right? Dams, bridges, things like that. This was the notion of 1933, not so much the vaccines and the disease stuff, but let's just build a bunch of stuff. It'll be a twofer, meaning we will borrow money now. We will build these huge projects that will create construction jobs in the short term, right? One of the things that's done in Long Beach, California is we had a major earthquake in 1933. Look it up. Your grandparents, if they lived in Long Beach, I'm sure they remembered it. It was a huge, devastating earthquake. When you read about this in like textbooks about Long Beach at the time, half of Wilson High School fell down. It like crumbled because they didn't build things to earthquake code in the 20s. Now, the old main part of Wilson stayed up, as some of the, exterior buildings kind of crumbled and stuff. And so the idea was, let's rebuild some of this infrastructure. Let's build some of these, bridges and roads that cracked and fell apart. Let's rebuild some of these schools. Let's build them now to code. Let's do all of this stuff. And so that would be the notion. Construction jobs in the short term. All those men that will go and work on the job will have an income. They'll go buy food and clothes for their kids. They'll pay their rent. That'll stimulate the economy. Now, it's not a permanent job. It's temporary, but the idea is it'll jumpstart everything. It'll get it going again. And then when this infrastructure is done, it'll improve education, health, communication, transportation, the economy, et cetera, right? An amazing amount of infrastructure was built in the 1930s. The Empire State Building was built in the middle of the Great Depression, largely with public money, with money from the state of California. It put people to work. Now, they couldn't fill up all the office space there because the economy was still rotten for several years. But by the time of World War II, most of the 88 floors of the Empire State Building, the tallest building in the world at the time, was full and humming along. You guys know that originally the Empire State Building was supposed to be, dual purpose. It was an office building, but also it was supposed to be an anchor to tie transatlantic dirigibles. right? These blimps, this is before like air travel where people went to airports. People were terrified to fly back then because planes flew at a much lower elevation where it's really bumpy and people aren't flying way up in upper layers of the atmosphere where you're in the jet stream and it's much more calm. And so people flew across the Atlantic on blimps, on dirigibles, basically. And so when you got to the other side, you had to drop your rope and they would tie it around something. It never came off. They were just like, you're going to bump into the Chrysler building and everything else there. It'll pop the balloon. We can't do that. But nonetheless, we built the Empire State Building. Out here on the West Coast, we built the Golden Gate Bridge. Maybe you have a picture of yourself in front of it, like every other person that I know in the world. Everybody has that darn picture on social media of them in front of the Golden Gate Bridge, right? Again, there was no way to get from San Francisco across the bay to Vallejo other than to drive south and then east all the way around. You had to go south all the way to Palo Alto or around to Oakland and Berkeley, and then all the way up to Vallejo. It was over an hour drive to go around, or it was just 10 minutes across the bay if you could build a bridge. And so they spent a fortune, and the footage of this is amazing. They had these giant water pumps that would like pump the water away, and it looks like Moses parting the Red Sea or something, where you have sort of a cavity that's created, and then workers would go down there and pour the cement. And in just a few years, we have this miraculous Golden Gate Bridge. It took a lot of money, created thousands of jobs in the short term. All those men got construction jobs and paid their bills. But then when it was done, we still are using it today for trade, communication, transportation, everything. And the same thing could be said for all over the country. A major bridge is built in New York City at the time. It's called the Triborough Bridge. Not very well known on the West Coast, but at the time, the 5 boroughs of New York City were not very well connected. There was a lot of connectivity between Brooklyn and Manhattan, and a lot of between Manhattan and New Jersey, but that was about it. It was actually very hard. There was a lot of ferry boats still that ran over the Hudson in the East River. And so a bridge was built in Queens that would connect Queens, the Bronx, and Manhattan. 3 boroughs, the Triborough Expressway. So it was this massive bridge, very tall, the tallest in the world at the time. And again, created jobs in the short term and then trade, communication, transportation in the long term. And so this is basically what Keynes said. And so Roosevelt tried to do this in numerous different ways. Most of these programs have this theory, is that we'll borrow money and we'll just build a bunch of stuff and it'll be dual purpose. So the first would be the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was almost like joining the army, where if you were a man and you had lost your job, you could go apply, and then they'd send you all around the country building playgrounds and parks and bridges and dams all over the place. You would be paid $30 a month. 27 of those dollars would be sent home to your family. You would get 3. Now you might say, how do you live off $3 a month? Well, it was the 30s. The dollar went a lot further back then, and they give you free room and board. So you're not spending money on food or on shelter. It would just be on, fun stuff for yourself on weekends and evenings. And so the CCC was not open very long. It was only about 2 years, but it built a number of things all over the country. Again, when the work is done, you have this wonderful, permanent or semi-permanent structure left that will improve the lives of millions of Americans. The FERA was a very smart idea. Whenever there's an economic downturn, one of the simplest things the federal government can do is give money to the states. The states already have the apparatus for welfare and education and transportation. They handle all that stuff mostly. And so the idea is they just don't have the money. They're cutting back their budgets. A lot of states have these very strict constitutions where they do not allow for deficit spending. They have to balance their budgets. Federal government doesn't have to do that. So you can just borrow, give money to the states, and the states would operate relief programs. So a lot of people got welfare in 1933 and 1934, the very first time ever in American history where you had federal welfare. And the government, even other than just giving it to the states, did create the very first federal welfare program in America called AFDC, Aid to Family with Dependent Children, where if you were an able-bodied man or a married couple, you couldn't get it. But if you had children that were dependent on you and the breadwinner didn't have a job, you could apply for welfare and get a check every month, just so you didn't starve and lose your home. It was temporary. It just lasted 2 years, for 33 and 34, during the worst years of the Depression. And then people were kind of turned off the rolls after that. The AAA was a huge program with very mixed results. It's very complicated, but basically here's what it would do. The federal government determined that there was just too many farmers, that the farmers were overproducing basically, and that farm prices had collapsed, that it was so ultra competitive that the average price of an agricultural commodity was lower than what it cost to produce, right? So a gallon of milk, let's say, was 7 cents a gallon. I don't know if this is correct, but you'll get the relative terms here. A gallon of milk cost X in the actual grocery store, but the farmer took 10 cents to produce it. And so you're losing 3 cents for every gallon of milk that you produce. Any smart farmer would tell you, I'm going out of business. Like, the more I work, the more I'm in debt. This is stupid. I'm just going to slaughter the dairy cow that normally you would just use to produce milk, eat the meat, and then walk off the farm, let the bank repossess it, and just go live in Chicago and be a homeless person. That's what a lot of people did in 1933. Now, the libertarian economists, the Hooverite, would say, well, this is what you want. You want to decrease production of food so it'll boost the prices back up. That's capitalism taking care of itself. Yes, but it's leaving behind a lot of devastation in its wake. Number one, the farmer, his life is over, his family's life is over, right? Second, the big cities don't want any more people. They've got enough unemployed people. They don't want more people coming into their cities and getting on the welfare rolls. So they're very unhappy about this. And most frighteningly enough, what if a lot of farmers in one particular corner of the country go bankrupt, walk off their farm? There might be food shortages, not nationwide, but in certain corners of the country. Because remember, this is still a country where we're mostly connected with railroads. People drove within cities, but if you had to traverse the country, you're doing it on a train. Most food is moved around on trains, and there's a shelf life there. You couldn't grow food in California and ship it all the way to New York perpetually and just do that forever. You needed local communities to be able to have food grown close to them. And it was very frightening that maybe this would collapse the farming system in America. There were millions of farmers that were just that close to going out of business. So what does the AAA do? It convinces farmers to do the opposite of what capitalism would have them do. Ideally, you want to produce as much as you can so that you can do better than your opponents. What everybody should have been doing is cutting back on production to boost prices. This is what OPEC does with oil. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries says, if we all produce oil as much as we can and compete against each other, the price will collapse and we'll all be worse off. But if we collude, if we work together and cut back production, we can sell this stuff for longer and make more money in the long term because it'll be more expensive. It's hard to get that kind of cooperative activity, but government could produce that. So the AAA basically went out and told farmers, you cannot produce on this quadrant of your land right here. We're going to divide your land into 4 quadrants. You can grow on these 3. This one will be empty. It'll be fallow. Don't grow anything on it. Now, farmers, of course, were very angry at this, and they said, you can't make me do that. I make more money if I grow on that. And the government came in and said, okay, we will pay you. We'll literally give you cash for the imaginary grain that you would have grown on that quadrant. Doesn't exist. You don't have to do it. You don't have to waste the fertilizers or labor doing it. You grow on the 3 quadrants and you sell that, and here's the money for the stuff you never even grew. So farmers were kind of scratching their heads going, all right, sounds good to me. Some of them even tried to treat the system by taking the money and then growing the grain anyway, but they would get in trouble for that. Government would come out and make them stop. Now, this was very controversial because most Americans are consumers of food, and prices went up rather than down, which was very difficult in a depression. And it just seemed immoral to be literally wasting food in the middle of a time when people were hungry. Now, people didn't starve in America during the Depression. Some people went hungry, but people survived because of laws like this that stabilized the farming industry. It may seem counterintuitive. Why would you want prices to go up? Well, in economics, there's something called elastic goods versus inelastic goods. An elastic good is one which the demand highly is reactive to the price, right? And I always liken this to, gasoline. If you have 2 gas stations across the street from each other and one selling for $3.05 a gallon and one selling for $3 a gallon, everyone goes to the one that's $3 a gallon, unless there's some other issue, right? The lines are too long or whatever. But say that they're both totally equal, selling the same product, no line, not any more convenient to go to one or the other. Which one would you go to? I'm going to the one that's $3, right? Even though it's 5 cents and it's not that big of a deal. Why would you go there, right? Soda often operates the same way. Most people don't care about Pepsi versus Coke. And if it's $1.05 for a 2 liter versus 99 cents, we're all going to buy the 99 cents, or almost everybody. It's highly reactive to the price. Other things are highly non-reactive to price because it's food. And you're not going to say, well, I'm just not going to spend money on food this month. Well, you'll starve. So you have to. It doesn't matter how expensive you make milk and grain and potatoes and flour. Those are staples. They're major products that are the ingredients for making all other meals. And so people will go and buy milk and flour and bread and sugar and all the rest of it, no matter what the price is. Medicine's often the same way. If you are diabetic and you need insulin, it doesn't matter what the price is. The price could be $1 million for a dose, or it could be a penny a dose. You're going to buy the same amount, no matter what. And so demand doesn't react to it. And so this is why food is a highly inelastic good. So people used a greater proportion of their income and savings on food. And I mean, it was rough, but milk back then there was no plastics or anything. Milk came in a can. And so people would buy a little can of milk, pop it open, feed their little 2-year-old, and then, drink a little of the rest of it. And maybe that was all you could afford, but you didn't starve to death. It was also welfare. You could go in and use as the beginning of food stamps, where you could go in and buy that kind of stuff. And that stabilized the agricultural sector. Now, there's a lot of flaws in the AAA, a lot of people angry with it, and it's still a legacy today. If you guys don't know, we have an unbelievably free economy, meaning that we have very few regulations in America compared to every other advanced country. One large exception is the agricultural industry. They still get huge subsidies. A subsidy is the opposite of a tax. When the government gives you money, tell you what, I'd love one of those if we just subsidized teachers and said, you spend so much in your classroom every year, here's $10,000 just for being you, Mr. Osborne. That would be awesome. Farmers get that every year. Soy farmers, grain farmers, corn farmers, they just get money to pay for all their operating costs. Why does the government have them today? Because we want food to be very cheap. And it is, by and large. The price of a loaf of bread has not really fluctuated in the last 30 years. It's basically the same. So no matter how poor people are, they're not going to starve in America. And even if they can't afford it, we will give them food stamps or some other form of welfare so that they can buy it. So still a legacy of the Great Depression, the AAA. The TVA, this is the Tennessee Valley Authority. Amazingly, as late as the 1930s, millions of Americans there in the Deep South, the poorest area of the country. The Tennessee Valley is the Tennessee River, which flows out of the Ohio through the mountains of Tennessee into Alabama. And the deltas, sort of break off and they irrigate, 5 southern states, the poorest states in the Union: Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And the idea was we would put a dam on the Tennessee River that would prevent flooding, and it would provide electricity for 5 million Americans. Hook them up for free. It was so expensive to actually build an electric grid. You needed to do that in big urban areas where people had a lot of money. No electric company wanted to do that in the South where no one had any money. But electricity just improved your life drastically. And so now the federal government set it up and then sold it to the electric companies who then operated it afterwards. The operating cost was paid for by the taxpayer. So now people in the South have flood control and they have electricity. So they have electric lighting in their homes. They, have electric heaters now in their homes. They have electric fans. They even can buy a washer dryer. This was amazing. It sort of dragged a huge proportion of the country into the 20th century with all the benefits of it. Can you imagine what loyal Democrats these people would be? If you didn't have electricity one day and then the next day you did and a president gave it to you, you would love that guy. Absolutely. And they did here. The NIRA, this is kind of confusing, but this is the National Industrial Recovery Administration. The idea here, again, is that industry was too competitive, that Ford and GM and General Electric were producing too many refrigerators and trucks. And so the idea was to convince them to cut back production, to have a sort of an established minimum wage, but none of it was dictated to by the government to the industries. It was like, let's get together and agree to the standards. So the union sat down, the AFL, the industries, the government, and they sort of set what all the standards would be. And they said, okay, if you abide by all this, we'll approve it. We'll give you a little blue eagle to put on your packaging. Now you can agree not to do any of this, but you just won't get the government seal of approval. But if you do all the things, we will, you couldn't have child labor, all these kind of regulations. And they say, all right, you get the blue eagle, the NIRA logo. And then government spent a fortune on propaganda telling Americans in newsreels and on the radio, don't buy a product unless it's got the NRA or NIRA logo. And it didn't really work. The Supreme Court struck it down, but it was an interesting idea. The PWA, right? More money, just huge amounts of deficit spending to build roads and bridges and schools and all that stuff. The SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, would monitor the stock market. So now they would make sure you couldn't publish false earnings reports. You had to be above board. You couldn't do these sort of stock market swindles and scams and stuff. All of this was great. And Wall Street even called for it because they just said, a little scheming's okay, but it gets out of hand sometimes. One of the greatest achievements that Roosevelt was able to get was a repeal of prohibition. In 1933, Roosevelt basically campaigned on this idea that prohibition was a failure, it wasn't working, crime rates had increased, and this would be better for the economy. The whole industry, when alcohol was abolished, it was an industry that was the 7th largest industry in America, was the alcohol production industry. So we said, let's bring it back. And so the Volstead Act was repealed, and they now said beer is the exception, and you could go out and get a glass of beer. All the other ones would be banned for another few months until the 18th Amendment was repealed, which it eventually was. So now you could go out and you could drink again legally. And so things improved. Not to an enormous degree, but if the unemployment rate was 25% in 1933, it probably dropped to about 20% in 1934. Not fantastic, still terrible, in fact, but appreciably better. Almost everyone in the country could point to something and say, this program helped me out. I didn't lose my home. I got, food aid. He saved my farm. He saved, whatever. Almost everybody could point to something FDR had done and said, bravo, great job. And so this was to the benefit of the Democratic Party. The Democrats had 310 of 435 seats in the House. They then increased that in the 1934 elections to 319. And the Democrats went from 60 senators to 69 senators. This is before there were 50 states. There were only 48 states. So there were only 96 senators, and the Democrats had 69 of them. So about 3/4 of the House and Senate are now in the Democratic Party. Now, it's a very different party than today. Very confusing, in fact. In some ways, it was way more conservative because, white Southern racists, the KKK wing of the party, was still Democratic. But you also had these Northern people like Roosevelt who were anti-racist and who were very progressive on a lot of issues, not only on race, but on the economy and all these other issues. But nonetheless, it was a good day to be a Democrat. At the 1936 convention, Roosevelt came out. He was basically coronated. There was no one else who was going to run. He was immensely popular, and Roosevelt does very well in the midterms there. But it was odd because you had these sort of different groups within the Democratic Party that did not get along, but they were all supporting Roosevelt. The KKK supported FDR. I'm sorry to say, but it's true. They adored him and they loved him and they gave him their support. Also at the 1936 convention, the NAACP, the most prominent and effective civil rights organization in America at the time. Northern African Americans were immensely loyal to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party had kind of abandoned them. They were the party first of Lincoln and Reconstruction, but then kind of stopped talking about that stuff by the turn of the 20th century. And many African Americans said, well, what are you going to do for us? Like any other group, they got very politically savvy, and FDR pointed to a whole slew of programs that were very effective. Before any program was implemented, Roosevelt would often talk with his wife, Eleanor, and say, how can we offer some kind of help to African Americans? Because they are, the most marginalized group in America, or one of them anyway. And so certain things were done, like when the Hoover Dam was built, right? Another one of these Great Depression programs. You would borrow money, build this enormous dam, create all these jobs, and then in the long term, you'd provide electricity for millions of people in the southwestern United States. It still does that today. But also, Roosevelt would always make sure that enough jobs went to the Black community, right? Make sure, like Black people, like 15% of the American population, but I want to make sure 20% of the jobs there are filled by Black workers. Now, they were still segregated. They lived in separate facilities on different sides of the camp, which was crazy, but that was America at the time. But at least there was a concern about the Black community. And that's why Black Americans voted for Roosevelt. But so did the KKK, which was crazy. Why did they vote for Roosevelt? Well, he could point to things like the TVA, right? Y'all were really struggling last week and now you got electricity. Isn't that great? When people are absolutely desperate and near starvation, they kind of forget how much they hate other people. And so Roosevelt kind of said different things to different people and got them all to vote for him, basically. It was a good time to be a Democrat, basically. You couldn't lose at that time. Now, that's not to say Roosevelt didn't have his haters. Boy, he had them. But he was an immensely popular president. About 60% of Americans either voted for Roosevelt or supported him at some point during his administration. Very high approval ratings. But the 40% that hated him. Like some people refused to even say his name. They were rich, waspy families in Connecticut where you could not say that man's name for 12 years. It was like a curse word almost. He was considered a traitor to his class. He was one of us. He went to our prep schools and he was, from the sort of patrician, old, almost nobility class in America. And he betrayed us. He's, looking out for these poor folks. What's wrong with this man? So the Liberty League was one of these Republican organizations founded basically saying all these New Deal regulations, take our freedoms away. Charles Coughlin was one of these very crazy demagogues in the 30s, sort of a homegrown fascist. He was a Catholic priest who would preach on the radio. And at first he sounded pretty normal. He founded an organization called the National Union for Economic and Social Justice, I think was the name of it. And he was calling for all kinds of inflationary policies and government spending and stuff. But then he started to kind of go off the deep end and he started saying that the whole Great Depression was the fault of Jewish bankers and a secret Jewish conspiracy. And that kind of stuff never really flew in America, and people start to turn off their radios at that time. But Irish Catholic people love the guy. He was an Irish Catholic priest and he preached in Michigan to mostly an Irish Catholic audience. But people all over the country listened to the guy, and he blasted Roosevelt too for not going after this Jewish conspiracy. National Union for Social Justice, that's what it was called. Upton Sinclair, very famously, was the author of The Jungle in 1902, and that was a very famous book that influenced the progressive era. He runs for governor of California in 1934, loses, but just barely, under this platform of EPIC, ending poverty in California. We're going to have these socialist programs. Believe it or not, California was a very conservative state at the time. It terrified a lot of people, so Hollywood and a lot of other industries put a fortune into all kinds of campaign commercial film strips that would destroy Upton Sinclair, and they did. Huey Long was another one. He was the senator and then later governor from Louisiana, basically a socialist. He was in the Democratic Party, but called himself a socialist and said, Roosevelt's not going far enough. We need to nationalize all of our industries. If you guys don't know what nationalize is, it's one of these terms that's just so anti-American. Americans just revile against this kind of stuff. And honestly, it's not always a bad idea, but Americans always shy away from it. So what is nationalization? It is when the government seizes ownership of a certain industry and runs it for itself. So like in Britain, the hospitals are nationalized. They don't have private hospitals. They're all owned and operated by the government. Every single doctor and nurse is a government employee in Britain. In other countries, the railroads are run by the government. In Saudi Arabia and in Mexico and in Venezuela, the oil is run by a state-run corporation, essentially. Pemex in Mexico, PDVSA in Venezuela, Aramco in Saudi Arabia. It's not always a terrible idea, but in America, nothing has really ever been nationalized with like one or two exceptions. Number one, the post office is sort of a national industry that private ones compete against, UPS and those kind of ones. The only other one is really Amtrak, our national train system, which nobody uses or takes, right? I would love to take it, but it's so horrible, right? You guys ever take the train? What is it called? The Surf Rider or whatever? You can take it from downtown Long Beach or Anaheim, and you can ride the train all the way down to San Diego. Great. It takes twice as long to get there, and then you don't have your car when you're in San Diego. Isn't it wonderful? I'm joking, but only a little bit. Public transportation has never really caught on in this country. The only person that takes Amtrak is Joe Biden. If you guys have heard his story, he rode Amtrak for like 40 years because you can actually back east, it kind of works, and you can ride it from DC to Delaware because it's only like a 2 hour. But sorry. But in any case, this was just unthinkable in America. But Huey Long was calling for nationalizing the banks, right? Not just regulating them, but taking them over from the private companies, nationalizing the railroad industry, nationalizing the oil industry, nationalizing the electric companies. This terrified a lot of people, and Huey Long was calling for it. So Roosevelt was an interesting guy. Even though he was a liberal and he leaned to the left, he had people on his far left that he had to kind of quiet down from time to time, and he successfully did that. But he also had conservatives attacking him from the right. Francis Townsend. This is one of the great stories of the Great Depression, and it brings your hometown back into it. This was a man, a doctor, who worked in geriatrics with older Americans, and he got very sick and tired of seeing his patients in the alleyways and streets of Long Beach, California, digging through trash cans for food. It very much upset him. And he said, why are people that are 70 and 75 digging through trash cans and still having to work in grocery stores so they can make money? They should be retired. Well, the reason why was their whole life savings was wiped out. And so he came up with an idea where all Americans who worked would pay a tax that would go into a pension fund that would then give that pension to retired Americans. They could then actively retire, and that would reserve those jobs for the younger people. Interesting idea. Roosevelt picked it up and ran with it. This was a little teeny newspaper called the Press-Telegram in Long Beach, California. And the idea really just got picked up by all the other major newspapers. Everyone started promoting it. And so Roosevelt passed this in 1935. So we have Social Security. If you guys don't know what Social Security is, you're like, oh yeah, that number that we have. The number is sort of an afterthought. The number is to identify you so that you're not scheming the system, right? You pay into it your whole life, and then when you're 65, then you can get it. It's also now been expanded to include survivor benefits, disabled benefits, right? Like, God forbid, if the breadwinner of your family passed away, you could get Social Security survivor benefits until you're 18. If someone was disabled in your family and they were an able-bodied worker, prior to that time, you could get disability payments from Social Security. So it's only been expanded and increased. One of the most popular programs in American history, actually borrowed from the Germans. It was Otto von Bismarck who came up with the idea. But even Otto von Bismarck said, I stole it from the Americans because this is how they pay for their Civil War veterans in retirement, which was a relatively small group of people in the whole country. Now it would cover everybody. America is a very interesting country. We have an incredibly soft spot in our hearts for children and the elderly. Everyone else in between, it's like you're on your own, right? If you're an able-bodied man, forget it. We don't want to give you any handouts or welfare whatsoever. Now, men have other advantages, certainly, in the society, but we don't really have a soft spot for those people like age 20 to 60. But we can't stand it when the elderly or veterans or or little children are suffering, and we try to do our best to alleviate their suffering at least. Let's go on to the next slide. This is 1935. This is known as the Second New Deal. With a new Congress that was overwhelmingly Democratic, Roosevelt said, looks like people want even more of this. Depression wasn't over, so he continued to spend money. The WPA Act was passed, a further $5 billion in deficit spending to create jobs and get the economy going. So more is being spent. The Social Security Act of 1935, like I said, this is a pension program started at the time. Now, interestingly enough, life expectancy at the time was only 62 years old, and you had to be 65 to get Social Security. This would be the equivalent today if they made Social Security eligible when you're 80, right? Because 78's life expectancy, you have to wait till you're 80 to get it. We don't do that, right? It's, you get it at 65, which is why there's so much weight under the system, because life expectancies increased that much. We've gone from 62 to 78, from the 30s to today. And so many more Americans are living longer and getting Social Security now, but it's a great program. Maybe the most important thing, at least in the short term, that Roosevelt did during that Second New Deal of 1935 was the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act. This law revolutionized union membership. It used to be that being in a union wasn't a right. Your boss could fire you, or the government could abolish unions entirely. In a lot of conservative states, unions were illegal. Strikes were illegal. In other states, you were allowed to, but the boss could fire you because it was his business. Under this law, it did a number of things. Number one, it said states cannot pass any laws restricting unions, and the boss cannot fire you for forming a union. It then also gave resources. It basically said if a shop, a factory of some kind, a plant, decided to hold an election, whether they want to unionize, the federal government would come out. The Labor Department would send lawyers out and they would have an election and monitor it. They'd make sure Henry Ford was like up in his office and not bothering or threatening workers. They'd have ballots and election booths. They'd vote. If they formed a union, then government lawyers would come in and say, here's how you negotiate. Let me help you out with this. Gave immense resources. This is what Roosevelt did to a lot of left-wingers to get him out of his hair. Like all these, frankly, communists and socialists in the government that were screaming at the top of their lungs, we have to nationalize everything. Roosevelt said, hey, I'm going to put you on the NLRA, right? Technically the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. Because all you could do is just settle strike disputes. You wouldn't be marching in the streets with hammers and sickles. And so Roosevelt would say, yeah, how would you like to be on the NLRB? They're, voting in the Ford plant next week. A lot of these communist guys were like, yeah, Henry Ford, that no good son of a gun, brutalized two of my brothers in the last strike, right? Called out the Pinkertons and they suffered concussions and one of them even died. And so these guys were very, very, very strong on businesses and strong for labor unions, and it changed America forever. Union membership had peaked in the country in 1919 with 5 million union members during World War I. Then all of the Republican administrations of the 20s just declared open season. They just said, let's get rid of these labor unions. And labor union membership just plummeted during the 20s. It went down to 3.3 million members in 1929 from a high of 5 in 1919, and then it cratered out at 2.8 million in 1932. 10 years later, in the middle of World War II, it was at 10.5 million people. So effectively it quadrupled during that time. Now, this is good for a couple of reasons. Number one, this was great for wages for workers, the working class, got all this benefit. But politically, it was so smart for Roosevelt to do, because these 10.5 million workers, who are they going to vote for? They're going to be dyed-in-the-wool Democrats for the rest of their lives. Not only them, but all their family members. For every man that works in a factory that's in the AFL or CIO, he's going to tell his wife, we're Democrats. He's going to tell his brothers, his parents, his nieces and nephews, everyone in the family, we are a union family. So that 10.5 million is really understating the political power here. This is the reason why, for the next 50 years, the Democratic Party dominated national politics. Most of the time, either the Congress or the president or both were Democratic. And even when you did get a Republican president like Nixon or Eisenhower, they were very pro-union. Shockingly, when you look back at it, to the extent the Republican Party is so hostile to unions today, Eisenhower didn't really mind them so much. So this was a complete change in America. Now, it wasn't without its issues. There are problems with unions. I'm in the teachers union, and I will tell you, I can't even look at social media right now. There's so many people that just are hating on teachers now. It's our fault that we're not reopening. And I just feel like, dude, I didn't get to vote on that issue. The union negotiated with other people. The government decided that we would close it down. But I get it. A lot of people are blaming us because the schools aren't open. Just like in America, whenever there was a major strike, the unions were blamed and they were called lazy and all the rest of it, of course. Yet, more Americans, more than ever before, were in a union. Sorry, hang on one second. So, unionization drastically increased. Overnight, the CIO is made. In 1934, it didn't exist. By 1936, it was the largest union in America. It even overcame the AFL. They would then merge in 1955 and become the AFL-CIO. But for a while there, it was like the AFL was kind of the more conservative union. The CIO was basically a socialist labor union with very left-wing ideology, like the IWW, like the Knights of Labor before it. And it was all mainstream. They loved Roosevelt and they voted for him. Next, 1936. Roosevelt had built together a coalition of people in a party that was going to ensure he was going to get reelected easily. He absolutely trounced the Republican in 1936. He ran against Alfred Landon from Kansas. And one of the saddest stories I've ever heard in politics, Alf Landon's own home state of Kansas voted against him in 1936. Only 2 states voted for the Republican. And that was Maine and Vermont. Again, 2 New England states, but even Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire decided this Roosevelt guy really isn't that bad. We like him. And so when you win 46 out of 48 states, it's a good day for you. This was the high point of his popularity. He could do pretty much anything he wanted. And it was a great day to be FDR. There were also other reforms that went on during this time. Liberals who had got into the government because of economic reasons had a very soft spot in their hearts for minorities. They tried to push for certain things like an anti-lynching law, but it was killed by filibuster in the Senate. But they were able to pass the IRA, which is known as the Indian Reorganization Act, which granted citizenship for the first time to Native Americans. Before that, they were members of a tribe who could only interact with the government through treaty and court, like suing on behalf of a treaty. Now they were granted citizenship, they could vote, they could serve in office, or they could utilize their rights under the treaties and the courts that they had before. They got both, which was wonderful. The arts, Roosevelt gave a fortune to artists. Artists were out of work too. So painters like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo got, huge subsidies to go out and paint frescoes in New York City subways and libraries. Dorothea Lange got, grants to go out and document the Great Depression by taking photographs. Georgia O'Keeffe painted a lot of flower pictures during the 30s and got these grants. One of the greatest history books ever written was a wonderful book called Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois. We talked about him before. Remember that up to this point, the history of Reconstruction was from that movie I told you about, Birth of a Nation. The history textbooks in this country had argued ever since the 1880s, pretty much, that Reconstruction was a crime perpetrated on the white South, that it was angry Northerners who usurped power, they were corrupt, that African Americans were not suited for self-government, and that the KKK were heroes. That was the understanding of Reconstruction for many years. And I'm very grateful that the government gave this academic from Harvard a bunch of money. He went down to the South and he interviewed old Black folks that had been born as slaves in the 1840s and 1850s, and asked them, what was slavery really like? What was Reconstruction really like? And these stories are amazing, where a Black man or Black woman in Alabama will say, well, let me go show you my picture book. And they'll go get down the family album and they'll show their great grandfather or grandfather who was born a slave, and then he's in his blue uniform during the Civil War, and then he became a sheriff when the war was over. And they would just tear up and well with pride and say, where are we in the history books? Well, W.B. Du Bois compiled all their stories into a wonderful book that told an alternative narrative that is today the accepted story of Reconstruction. I'm so glad that the government did that. Can't put a price on that. It's our own history and legacy. Okay, last slide. So Roosevelt was riding high, but 1937 is an absolute low moment for him. So first, the Supreme Court started going after him. In his first 4 years from 1933 to 37, no openings came up on the Supreme Court. Nobody died, nobody resigned. And the Supreme Court had been basically packed by Republicans, by Coolidge and Hoover and Harding and even Wilson before him. And Wilson was no liberal. He was a pretty conservative Democrat. And before them, Taft and Roosevelt. So there were almost no liberals on the court. Really, there were maybe 2, 3. Louis Brandeis was, kind of liberal. Benjamin Cardozo was a bit liberal. Oliver Wendell Holmes was kind of a down the middle moderate. Everyone else, the other 6, were hardcore pro-business, anti-New Deal conservatives. And they started striking down parts of the AAA, parts of the NIRA. And Roosevelt was just fit to be tied. You mean to tell me I got 60% of the vote? I won 46 states. I have 3/4 of the Congress. The American people are screaming at the top of their lungs that they want the New Deal. And 6 men on the Supreme Court are just saying, no, we don't care what the rest of the country wants to do. How dare they? Roosevelt attacked them. He gave speeches going after him. And then he came up with this idea that very much backfired on him, the court packing plan, as it was called. Roosevelt came up with an idea where legislatively you could increase the size of the court from 9 members to 15. This would give him 6 new nominees to the court. He could pack it with liberal judges who would just say everything's constitutional that FDR wants to do. Now, there's nothing unconstitutional about this. The size of the court's been tinkered with from time to time in our country. But this just seemed to be a little frightening. It was kind of what was going on in Europe with Mussolini and Franco and Hitler. And I'm not trying to make a comparison between Hitler and FDR. But this is what those men did, is they kind of slowly at first started to dismantle checks and balances throughout the country. And then there were none left. In a very famous speech, the Republican leader of the Senate said that this is more power than a good man should want or a bad man should have. If FDR is a bad man, he shouldn't have this much power. If he's a good man, he shouldn't be asking for this much power. The Democratic Party turned on Roosevelt and they voted it down. The first time they said no to him. They had just been a rubber stamp for 4 years and just said, whatever you want, sir. And finally they said, no, this is too much, even for us. His own party turned on him. Part of it was because he was sort of disingenuous about this. Roosevelt didn't sell it as a program to save the New Deal. He sold it as a court reform, right? We need to help these old people. The idea was that we would add a new justice for every current justice that was over the age of 75 to kind of help them out. But it didn't make sense, right? How does that actually help the workload? Each justice has to hear every case, so it doesn't actually lighten the workload. It was dishonest to say it was court reform. It was packing the court, but it failed. But this is one of these weird instances where Roosevelt certainly loses the battle, but he wins the war, because he won again in 1940 and again in 1944, and Harry Truman wins in 1948. By the time that FDR resigned, he had replaced 8 of the 9 justices on the court. It was a Roosevelt court by then, and then Harry Truman would get 2 or 3 appointees as well. So all 9 members were hardcore liberals by the early 1950s. So we had a total change in the court, but that was yet to take place. So Roosevelt had a huge political defeat there. In the midst of this year, there was another recession, a recession in the middle of a depression. Yay. This is known as the Roosevelt recession, because people were willing to stick with Roosevelt for years because things were getting better. But then they got worse, and he couldn't blame it on Herbert Hoover anymore. They had been on a trajectory getting better. What happened was, for all this criticism that Roosevelt was just, spending money like crazy and a socialist, he was a conservative. He got very worried at the deficits and the debt, and he turned around and looked and said, I have to start balancing the budget. And so all those emergency programs, the WPA, the CCC, all of them were terminated in 1937 because the idea was, we've done enough. Those people can transition to the private sector and get jobs. It wasn't enough spending by far. If you look at the spending in World War II, it completely dwarfed everything in the Great Depression. We should have just put our foot on the gas and kept spending. That's what Germany and France and Britain did, and they got out of the Depression by 1935. We would limp along another 6 years. And so Roosevelt foolishly balanced the budget, and unemployment skyrocketed from 14% back up to 20%. And he couldn't blame it on Herbert Hoover. So you have a political crisis with the court packing plan, you have the Roosevelt recession, and then you had fascism on the rise. Hitler was already rearming, and he was threatening to march into Austria, and he would the next year in 1938. But really even worse than that was what the Japanese were doing. The Japanese were on a rampage in East Asia. They had invaded Manchuria in 1931 when Herbert Hoover was still president. They then invaded China itself in 1937. FDR went on the radio and tried to chide and reprimand the Emperor of Japan, and they just sort of laughed at us. And so did the Republicans. They just said, wow, you gave them a strict scolding, but what are you actually going to do? Americans were dead set against going to war with Japan. And just sort of chastising them wasn't going to do anything. He looked sort of foolish. They were thumbing their noses at us. And who was going to stop them? The British and the French Navy was terrified about the Germans, so they weren't going to move their fleet to go deal with the Japanese. America alone was going to have to deal with this. We eventually would after Pearl Harbor, but in 1937, we looked pathetic and pitiful. So what to make of the New Deal? Was it effective or was it not? Well, most historians take the whole umbrella of the New Deal and they put it into 3 categories: relief, reform, and recovery, the 3 R's. Relief. Roosevelt did indeed get relief to the most desperate Americans in the most desperate hour of the Great Depression. You might give him, a C+ or B- for that. Wasn't enough. It should have gone on longer, all throughout the 30s, but for the first time ever, he was getting relief to people so that they didn't lose their farm, lose their home, or starve to death. Second is reform. This what you would probably give an A to the president. All of the banking and stock market reforms, the Emergency Banking Act and Glass-Steagall and the SEC really build sort of the modern foundation. I want you to note that we do not have another major banking failure crisis in America until 2008, for a long time. Why did we have it in 2008? Most historians look back at 1999 when Glass-Steagall, this great banking regulation, was repealed and the banks started to do crazy stuff, and then they went off the cliff in 2008. Okay, luckily it wasn't quite as bad because there still was FDIC and these other regulations, but all those regulations came with the consent of the banking community. They wanted it, the stock market community wanted it, and it stabilized the economy. It basically laid a foundation so that things could never quite get as bad as they were before. We're going to have recessions, where we might have 5 to 10% unemployment, but we would never again get a massive wave of bank failures that then prolong the misery for so long. By far the strongest aspect of the New Deal was reform, wonderful reforms. Probably the weakest of the 3 R's is recovery. Did the New Deal actually end the Great Depression? No. For some Americans it did, but look at it. After 4 years of Roosevelt and after 4 years of Hoover prior to that, we still had a 20% unemployment rate. People were still desperate. And technically, the recession ends in March of 1941, and it ends with the Lend-Lease Act. It basically ends when the federal government repeals these neutrality laws and says, we can sell weapons to Britain on credit, unlimited. And then we extend that to the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Almost overnight, like a light switch going off. Factories opened up, the government spent a fortune. FDR started rearming the country too, building up the Navy and having a peacetime draft. And unemployment finally went down under 10% in March of 1941. And by 1944, it was under 2%, the lowest ever. I think it bottomed out at like 1.2, 1.3%, the lowest it's ever been in American history. So World War II really ended the Depression, but the New Deal was helpful, and it becomes canonical in America, almost like you talk about the 13th and 14th Amendment with Reconstruction and the Civil War. You talk about the New Deal when you do the Great Depression. Okay, that's it for the New Deal. We will get to fighting the Germans again next time, and we will win a second time, right? US, we are back-to-back World War champs, right? All right, guys, I'll see you next time. Bye.